Good and evil do not exist. They never have existed. They are phantom concepts, sophisticated illusions created by human minds, desperate to impose meaning on a universe that operates according to forces that care nothing for your moral categories, your ethical frameworks, or your desperate need to believe that actions can be divided into neat categories of virtue and vice. Tonight, we abandon the final comfortable lie, the belief that there exists some cosmic standard of right and wrong that makes your choices meaningful beyond their practical consequences. We will strip away the elaborate moral architectures that humanity has constructed to avoid confronting the simple truth that governs all existence. There are only actions that benefit you and actions that harm you, decisions that create the outcomes you want, and decisions that prevent you from getting what you desire. This is not nihilism. This is clarity. This is not the absence of meaning, but the recognition that meaning is something you create through your choices and their consequences, not something you discover through moral philosophy or religious revelation. This is the understanding that will liberate you from the psychological chains of moral thinking and enable you to make decisions based on what actually works, rather than what feels virtuous. Over the next hour, we will examine how moral categories function as control mechanisms, why strategic thinking produces better outcomes than ethical thinking, and how abandoning the illusion of good and evil opens possibilities that moral people can never access. You will discover that the most successful, powerful, and ultimately beneficial people throughout history have been those who understood this fundamental truth about existence. By the end of this exploration, you will see that morality is not wisdom but limitation, not enlightenment but blindness, not the path to human flourishing, but the obstacle that prevents most people from creating the lives they actually want and contributing the value they're capable of creating. The belief in objective moral reality is perhaps the most persistent delusion in human psychology. From childhood, you were taught that certain actions are inherently good, while others are inherently evil, that virtue and vice exist as fundamental properties of behavior, that the universe itself recognizes and responds to moral categories. But examine any action that you've been taught is morally good or evil, and you will find that its moral status depends entirely on context, perspective, and who benefits from the action. There is no behavior that is universally good in all circumstances, no action that is universally evil, regardless of context, no moral principle that produces positive outcomes when applied without consideration of practical consequences. Consider the act of killing another human being. Your moral programming immediately categorizes this as evil, wrong, unacceptable. But this moral response ignores the vast range of contexts in which killing might produce better outcomes than not killing. Killing in self-defense, killing in defense of others, killing enemy soldiers during wartime, killing in medical situations where prolonged suffering serves no purpose. In each of these contexts, the same physical action produces different evaluations because the consequences are different. The moral framework forces you to create elaborate justifications and exceptions to maintain the illusion that killing is inherently wrong, while acknowledging that sometimes killing produces better outcomes than not killing. But these justifications reveal that you're not actually evaluating the moral essence of the action. You're evaluating its practical consequences and then applying moral labels based on whether you approve of those consequences. The same analysis applies to every moral category. Lying is supposedly wrong, yet you lie constantly to maintain social relationships, protect others' feelings, and navigate complex situations where truth-telling would produce worse outcomes than deception. Stealing is supposedly evil, yet taxation is mandatory taking of others' resources, and eminent domain is government theft of private property, both justified because the supposed benefits outweigh the costs. Violence is supposedly immoral, yet every government maintains police and military forces whose job is to use violence to enforce compliance with rules. Selfishness is supposedly wrong, yet every successful economic system depends on individuals pursuing their own interests in ways that incidentally benefit others. These contradictions exist not because moral systems are poorly designed, but because moral thinking itself is fundamentally flawed. It attempts to apply absolute categories to a reality that operates through relationships, contexts, and consequences that are constantly shifting based on circumstances and perspectives. The illusion of moral reality serves specific psychological and social functions, but it doesn't correspond to any actual feature of existence. Moral categories are interpretive frameworks that humans impose on reality, not discoveries about reality itself. They're tools for social coordination and psychological comfort, not accurate descriptions of how the universe actually operates. When you observe nature, the realm supposedly pure and untainted by human moral confusion, you see no evidence of good and evil. Predators kill prey without moral consideration. Plants compete for resources without ethical constraints. Natural disasters destroy without regard for the virtue or vice of their victims. Diseases spread without evaluating the moral worth of their hosts. Nature operates according to principles of cause and effect, competition and cooperation, adaptation and survival. These principles produce outcomes that humans interpret as good or evil based on whether those outcomes serve human interests. But the principles themselves are immoral. They operate without regard for moral categories. Human behavior, despite all our moral theorizing, follows the same basic patterns as natural processes. People pursue what they perceive as beneficial and avoid what they perceive as harmful. They cooperate when cooperation serves their interests and compete when competition produces better outcomes. They create alliances that provide advantages and abandon alliances that become costly. The moral framework obscures this reality by suggesting that people should behave according to abstract principles rather than practical assessment of consequences. It creates the illusion that virtue is its own reward, while ignoring the fact that virtuous people often suffer worse outcomes than those who focus on practical effectiveness. This moral thinking creates what philosophers call category errors, mistaking interpretive frameworks for objective reality. The person who believes in objective moral reality makes decisions based on conformity to abstract principles rather than evaluation of actual consequences. They choose actions that feel morally right rather than actions that produce the outcomes they want. This category error explains why moral people often achieve less than immoral people while feeling superior about their limited achievement. They're optimizing for moral performance rather than practical results, for feeling virtuous rather than being effective, for conforming to ethical standards rather than creating value. The illusion of moral reality also prevents people from adapting their strategies when circumstances change. If you believe that certain behaviors are inherently good, you continue using those behaviors even when they stop producing positive results. If you believe that certain approaches are inherently evil, you avoid them even when they might solve problems that your moral approaches cannot address. The person who abandons moral thinking doesn't become evil. They become strategic. They evaluate actions based on consequences rather than categories, on outcomes rather than intentions, on effectiveness rather than virtue. They develop what military strategists call situational awareness, the ability to assess what approaches will actually work in specific contexts, rather than what approaches conform to abstract principles. This strategic thinking produces better results, not just for the strategic thinker, but often for everyone affected by their decisions, because it focuses on solutions that actually work rather than solutions that feel morally satisfying. Once you abandon the illusion of good and evil, you discover that all human action can be understood through a much simpler and more accurate framework: the assessment of benefit and loss. Every decision you make, every action you take, every relationship you maintain or abandon, serves to either increase or decrease your access to things you want, while either increasing or decreasing your exposure to things you want to avoid. This benefit-loss framework operates at multiple levels simultaneously. There are immediate benefits and costs. What happens in the short term as direct consequences of your actions. There are strategic benefits and costs. How your actions position you for future opportunities and challenges. There are systemic benefits and costs. How your actions affect the larger systems and relationships that influence your long-term circumstances. The person who thinks strategically rather than morally learns to evaluate decisions across all these levels, rather than simply asking whether actions conform to moral principles. They ask, what do I gain and what do I lose through this choice? How does this decision affect my immediate circumstances, my future options, and my position within larger systems that influence my outcomes? This multi-level analysis often reveals that actions which feel morally wrong produce better total outcomes than actions which feel morally right. The selfish decision to prioritize your own development may benefit others more than the selfless decision to sacrifice your development for others' immediate comfort. The cruel decision to end a relationship that isn't working may serve everyone's interests better than the kind decision to maintain a dysfunctional connection. The benefit-loss framework also reveals why moral thinking often produces worse outcomes than strategic thinking. Moral thinking focuses on the inherent rightness or wrongness of actions without adequate consideration of consequences. Strategic thinking focuses on consequences while remaining neutral about the moral status of the actions that produce those consequences. Consider the difference between hiring decisions made on moral versus strategic grounds. The moral approach might prioritize hiring people who deserve opportunities based on their circumstances, efforts, or membership in groups that have faced historical discrimination. The strategic approach evaluates candidates based on their ability to contribute value to the organization's goals. The moral approach often produces worse outcomes for everyone involved. The organization becomes less effective. Existing employees must compensate for underperforming colleagues, customers receive lower quality service, and even the hired individuals may be placed in positions where they cannot succeed, leading to frustration and eventual failure. The strategic approach typically produces better outcomes for all parties. The organization becomes more effective, employees work with competent colleagues, customers receive better service, and hired individuals are placed in positions where they can succeed and develop their capabilities. The strategic decision-maker doesn't make hiring choices based on prejudice or indifference to social issues. They make choices based on what actually serves the interests of everyone involved, including the broader goal of creating successful organizations that can provide more opportunities and better services. In personal relationships, the benefit-loss framework reveals why many moral approaches to relationship management create worse outcomes than strategic approaches. The moral person maintains relationships based on loyalty, obligation, and the belief that commitment is inherently virtuous. The strategic person maintains relationships based on whether those relationships enhance their life and the other person's life. This strategic approach often produces healthier, more satisfying relationships because it selects for connections based on mutual benefit rather than moral obligation. It eliminates relationships that drain energy and create dysfunction while preserving and developing relationships that enhance both parties' lives. The moral approach often produces relationships based on guilt, dependency, and mutual limitation where people remain connected, not because they genuinely enjoy each other's company, but because ending the relationship would violate moral principles about loyalty and commitment. In financial decisions, the benefit-loss framework eliminates the moral confusion that prevents many people from building wealth effectively. Instead of feeling guilty about pursuing profit, accumulating resources, or charging fair prices for valuable services, the strategic person focuses on creating genuine value that others are willing to pay for. This approach typically creates more total wealth and benefit than moral approaches that focus on fairness, equal outcomes, or avoiding the appearance of greed. The person who focuses on value creation serves their customers better, builds more sustainable businesses, and generates more resources that can be used for whatever purposes they choose, including helping others if they decide that such help serves their values. The strategic framework also enables more effective responses to competitive situations. Instead of feeling bad about competing or trying to win at others' expense, the strategic person recognizes competition as a natural process that typically produces better outcomes for everyone by encouraging innovation, efficiency, and excellence. The moral person often handicaps themselves in competitive situations because they feel guilty about trying to win decisively. They compete half-heartedly or apologetically, ensuring that they remain safely mediocre rather than developing their capabilities to their fullest potential. The strategic person competes wholeheartedly because they understand that excellence serves not just their interests, but typically the interests of everyone who benefits from their high performance. The athlete who trains to dominate their sport creates better entertainment for fans. The business that seeks market leadership creates better products for customers. The individual who develops their capabilities to their fullest potential has more to offer in all their relationships and activities. Perhaps most importantly, the benefit-loss framework reveals that what people call evil is usually just ineffective strategy, approaches that create more costs than benefits over time. Lying, cheating, stealing, and violence are typically poor strategies, not because they're morally wrong, but because they create more problems than they solve when used by people who lack the skill to employ them effectively. The person who thinks strategically avoids these approaches not because they're immoral, but because they're usually counterproductive. Honesty is typically better than deception because it's easier to maintain consistent narratives. Cooperation is often better than exploitation because it creates sustainable relationships. Voluntary exchange is usually better than coercion because it produces willing partners rather than resentful enemies. But the strategic person remains open to approaches that moral thinking would categorically reject if those approaches would produce better outcomes in specific circumstances. They're honest when honesty serves their purposes, and diplomatic when complete honesty would create unnecessary problems. They cooperate when cooperation produces mutual benefit, and compete when competition motivates better performance. History provides overwhelming evidence that moral systems change with power structures, that what each society considers good or evil depends primarily on what serves the interests of those who control that society. This pattern appears with such consistency across cultures and time periods that it reveals morality not as discovery of eternal truths, but as creation of useful justifications for existing arrangements. Consider how moral evaluations of slavery evolved over time. For thousands of years, slavery was considered natural, necessary, and morally acceptable by virtually every major civilization. Ancient Greek philosophers argued that some people were naturally suited for servitude. Roman legal systems treated slaves as property, without moral consideration. Christian theologians found biblical justification for enslaving others based on race, religion, or conquest. These moral frameworks didn't emerge from careful analysis of slavery's effects on human well-being. They emerged from the practical needs of societies that had organized their economies around slave labor. Moral systems evolved to justify existing economic arrangements rather than to evaluate whether those arrangements actually served human flourishing. When slavery became economically inefficient due to industrialization and wage labor became more productive than forced labor, moral evaluations shifted dramatically. Within a few generations, the same religious and philosophical traditions that had justified slavery for millennia suddenly discovered that slavery was obviously immoral and always had been. This moral transformation didn't occur because people suddenly developed greater compassion or better understanding of human nature. It occurred because the power structures that benefited from slavery were being replaced by power structures that benefited from wage labor, and moral systems adapted to serve the new arrangements. The same pattern appears in every major moral transformation throughout history. The moral status of women's independence changed when economic systems required female participation in wage labor. The moral evaluation of homosexuality shifted when social conditions made sexual diversity less threatening to established institutions. The moral assessment of environmental protection evolved when environmental degradation began affecting powerful interests. In each case, behaviors and conditions that had been morally acceptable or morally required under previous systems became morally unacceptable when power structures changed. Meanwhile, behaviors that had been morally forbidden became morally required when they served new power arrangements. Medieval European society considered commercial activity morally suspect and praised subsistence farming as virtuous. The moral framework emphasized humility, acceptance of assigned social roles, and suspicion of material accumulation. This moral system served feudal power structures that required most people to remain in agricultural servitude, while small elites controlled land and resources. When commercial capitalism became the dominant economic system, these same moral traditions suddenly discovered that entrepreneurship was virtuous, that accumulation of wealth was evidence of divine favor, and that social mobility was morally praiseworthy. The Protestant work ethic emerged not from new revelations about morality, but from the practical needs of economic systems that required active, ambitious, commercially motivated populations. Political systems show the same pattern. Democratic societies teach that popular participation in governance is morally essential and that authoritarianism is evil. Authoritarian societies teach that strong leadership is morally necessary and that democracy creates dangerous chaos. Socialist societies teach that collective ownership is morally superior and that private property is theft. Capitalist societies teach that private property is morally essential and that socialism destroys individual freedom. These contradictory moral teachings cannot all be correct. If morality represents objective truth about right and wrong, but they all make sense if morality represents justification systems that help maintain existing power arrangements, by making those arrangements feel natural, necessary, and virtuous. Religious moral systems show similar adaptability to power structures. Early Christianity emphasized poverty, pacifism, and rejection of worldly success when Christians were a persecuted minority. When Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, the same theological traditions developed justifications for wealth, warfare, and political power. Islamic societies developed elaborate moral frameworks, justifying conquest and expansion when Muslim empires were growing. The same traditions emphasized peace and coexistence when Islamic societies needed to maintain stable relationships with more powerful neighbors. Modern secular moral systems follow identical patterns. Environmental morality emphasizes individual responsibility and consumption changes when addressing environmental problems through individual behavior. Change serves existing power structures. Environmental morality emphasizes systemic change and regulation when environmental problems threaten established interests and require institutional responses. Social justice morality focuses on individual prejudice and bias when addressing inequality through attitude change, serves existing systems. Social justice morality focuses on systemic oppression and institutional reform when inequality threatens social stability and requires structural modifications. These shifting moral emphases reveal that moral systems serve as management tools for complex social arrangements rather than as discoveries about eternal principles. They provide frameworks that help coordinate large populations while maintaining the stability and legitimacy of existing power structures. The strategic person understands this historical pattern and evaluates moral claims not based on their abstract validity, but based on whose interests they serve and what outcomes they produce. When someone makes a moral argument, the strategic response is to ask, who benefits if I accept this moral framework? What behaviors does this moral system encourage and discourage? How does this moral position serve the interests of those promoting it? This historical awareness prevents the strategic person from being manipulated by moral appeals that are actually requests to behave in ways that serve others' interests, rather than moral principles. It enables them to evaluate moral claims based on their practical consequences rather than their emotional appeal or social acceptability. Understanding how morality changes with power also reveals opportunities for strategic positioning. Moral systems that currently seem permanent and natural will eventually change as power structures evolve. The person who can anticipate these changes and position themselves advantageously relative to emerging moral frameworks can benefit from moral transitions that catch others unprepared. Most importantly, this historical perspective reveals that moral thinking itself is often a limiting factor that prevents people from adapting to changing circumstances. The person who remains committed to moral frameworks that served previous conditions may find themselves disadvantaged when those conditions change and new approaches become more effective. The strategic person maintains flexibility about methods while remaining clear about desired outcomes. They adapt their approaches as circumstances change, rather than remaining loyal to strategies that no longer produce the results they want. The transition from moral thinking to strategic thinking requires developing new decision-making processes that evaluate choices based on outcomes rather than categories, consequences rather than intentions, effectiveness rather than virtue. This strategic approach produces better results not just for the decision-maker, but typically for everyone affected by their choices. Strategic decision-making begins with what military analysts call objective definition, clearly identifying what you actually want to achieve, rather than what you think you should want to achieve, based on moral considerations. This requires distinguishing between goals that emerge from your authentic interests and capabilities versus goals that have been imposed by social expectations and moral frameworks. Most people never clearly define their actual objectives because they've been trained to feel guilty about their genuine desires and to substitute socially acceptable goals for their authentic aspirations. They pursue careers that seem morally praiseworthy rather than work that engages their deepest capabilities. They maintain relationships that appear virtuous rather than connections that enhance their actual experience of life. The strategic person spends significant time clarifying what they genuinely want to create, experience, and become rather than what others expect them to want, or what moral frameworks suggest they should pursue. This clarity enables them to evaluate decisions based on whether actions move them closer to or farther from their authentic objectives. Once objectives are clearly defined, strategic decision-making employs what economists call cost-benefit analysis, systematic evaluation of what you gain and what you lose through different choices. This analysis considers not just immediate consequences but long-term implications, not just direct effects but indirect results, not just personal impact, but effects on larger systems that influence your circumstances. This comprehensive analysis often reveals that choices which feel morally wrong produce better total outcomes than choices which feel morally right. The decision to end a relationship that isn't working may cause short-term emotional pain, but create long-term opportunities for both parties to find more compatible partners. The choice to charge premium prices for valuable services may seem greedy, but enables higher quality service and sustainable business operations. Strategic thinking also employs what intelligence analysts call scenario planning, considering multiple possible futures and evaluating how different choices position you for various contingencies. Instead of making decisions based on single expected outcomes, strategic thinking considers how choices perform across different possible scenarios. This scenario planning reveals why moral approaches often produce worse results than strategic approaches. Moral decisions are typically optimized for single scenarios based on idealistic assumptions about how others will respond to virtuous behavior. Strategic decisions are designed to produce acceptable outcomes across multiple scenarios, including situations where others don't reciprocate virtue or where circumstances change in unexpected ways. For example, the moral approach to financial planning might emphasize generous giving and minimal saving based on the assumption that virtuous behavior will be rewarded and that others will provide assistance if needed. The strategic approach considers scenarios where virtue is not rewarded, where assistance is not available, and where having personal resources enables better responses to unexpected challenges. Strategic decision-making also incorporates what psychologists call revealed preference analysis, paying attention to what people actually do rather than what they say they value. This analysis recognizes that people's behavior often contradicts their stated moral positions, and that understanding actual motivations produces better predictions about how others will respond to your decisions. The moral person makes decisions based on how others say they will respond to virtuous behavior. The strategic person makes decisions based on how others actually respond to different approaches, regardless of what they claim their values are. This behavioral focus often reveals opportunities that moral thinking misses. The person who claims to value fairness but consistently pursues their own advantage can be approached through their actual interests rather than their stated values. The organization that promotes social responsibility but prioritizes profit can be influenced through economic arguments rather than moral appeals. Strategic thinking also employs what military strategists call force multiplier identification, finding approaches that create disproportionate impact relative to the effort invested. Instead of distributing effort equally across all possible activities, strategic thinking concentrates resources on activities that produce the greatest return on investment. This concentration often contradicts moral frameworks that emphasize equal treatment and fair distribution of attention and resources. The strategic person may invest heavily in relationships that provide significant mutual benefit while maintaining minimal contact with people who drain energy without providing value. The moral person feels obligated to treat everyone equally and distribute their time and attention based on others' needs, rather than on the mutual benefit that relationships provide. This equal treatment approach often produces worse outcomes for everyone because it prevents the development of highly productive relationships that could create value benefiting larger networks of people. Strategic decision-making includes what negotiation experts call interest-based rather than position-based thinking. Instead of focusing on what people claim they want, strategic thinking analyzes what people actually need and finds solutions that serve underlying interests rather than stated positions. This approach often creates more satisfaction for everyone involved because it addresses actual needs rather than negotiating over positions that may not serve anyone's genuine interests. The strategic person can often find solutions that provide what others actually need, while also serving their own objectives, creating mutual benefit rather than zero-sum competition. The moral approach often gets trapped in position-based conflicts, where people argue about what seems fair or right, rather than exploring what would actually work for everyone involved. This moral focus on positions rather than interests frequently produces outcomes that satisfy no one's genuine needs while maintaining the appearance of virtue. Finally, strategic decision-making maintains what entrepreneurs call optionality preservation, making choices that maintain future flexibility rather than choices that feel morally committed, but limit future possibilities. Strategic thinking recognizes that circumstances change and that decisions which seem optimal under current conditions may become suboptimal as situations evolve. This flexibility often contradicts moral frameworks that emphasize loyalty, commitment, and consistency as virtues, regardless of whether maintaining these virtues continues to serve anyone's interests. The strategic person remains committed to outcomes while maintaining flexibility about methods, while the moral person often remains committed to methods while losing sight of whether those methods continue to produce desired outcomes. When you fully abandon moral categories as guides for decision-making, you don't become evil or socially destructive. You become free to pursue strategies that actually work rather than strategies that feel virtuous. This liberation creates possibilities for achievement and contribution that are impossible while moral thinking constrains your choices and limits your effectiveness. The person who has transcended moral thinking discovers that they can pursue ambitious goals without constantly questioning whether their ambitions are morally acceptable. They can compete effectively without feeling guilty about winning. They can accumulate resources without apologizing for their success. They can exercise influence without worrying whether they deserve to have power. This psychological freedom eliminates the internal resistance that slows down and undermines the efforts of morally constrained individuals. When you're not constantly evaluating your actions against moral standards, you can focus your full attention on identifying opportunities and implementing solutions that serve your authentic objectives. The liberation from moral thinking also enables what psychologists call cognitive flexibility, the ability to adapt your approaches as circumstances change, rather than remaining committed to methods that no longer produce desired results. Moral thinking creates cognitive rigidity because it treats certain approaches as inherently good, regardless of their effectiveness in specific situations. The immoral person can shift strategies fluidly, based on what works rather than what feels consistent with previous moral commitments. They can cooperate when cooperation produces mutual benefit and compete when competition motivates excellence. They can be generous when generosity serves their values and selective when unlimited giving would enable dysfunction. This strategic flexibility often produces better outcomes for everyone involved because it optimizes for results rather than moral performance. The amoral leader can make difficult decisions quickly without being paralyzed by moral considerations that don't actually serve anyone's interests. The amoral entrepreneur can adapt their business model based on market feedback, rather than remaining committed to approaches that feel morally satisfying but don't serve customers effectively. The liberation from moral constraints also enables what military strategists call tactical innovation, the development of new approaches that moral frameworks might prohibit, but that produce superior results. Moral thinking limits innovation because it categorizes certain approaches as unacceptable, regardless of their effectiveness. The amoral person can explore approaches that moral people avoid, often discovering methods that are more effective and ultimately more beneficial than conventional moral approaches. They can use psychological influence techniques that moral people consider manipulative. They can pursue competitive advantages that moral people consider unfair. They can make strategic alliances that moral people consider compromising. These immoral approaches often produce better outcomes because they work with human nature as it actually exists, rather than as moral frameworks. Imagine it should exist. The person who understands psychological influence can motivate others more effectively than the person who relies on moral appeals. The individual who pursues competitive advantages can create more value than the person who handicaps themselves for the sake of fairness. Perhaps most importantly, the liberation from moral thinking enables what we might call authentic contribution, the ability to help others and contribute to human flourishing based on your actual capabilities and interests, rather than moral obligations and social expectations. The moral person helps others because they feel obligated to help, because helping makes them feel virtuous, or because social pressure demands helping behavior. This motivation often produces ineffective help because it's not based on genuine understanding of what others need or authentic capability to provide meaningful assistance. The amoral person helps others when helping serves their authentic values and when they have genuine capability to create positive impact. This selective, strategic approach to helping often produces more total benefit because it concentrates resources and attention on areas where the helper can be most effective. The immoral person may help fewer people than the moral person, but the help they provide is typically more substantial and sustainable because it emerges from strength rather than obligation, from capability rather than guilt, from authentic choice rather than social pressure. This strategic approach to contribution also enables the amoral person to develop their capabilities more effectively because they're not constantly depleting their resources through obligatory helping that doesn't serve anyone's genuine interests. They can invest in their own development while remaining open to contributing to others when such contribution aligns with their values and capabilities. The liberation from moral thinking creates what entrepreneurs call strategic clarity, the ability to see situations without the distortion that moral categories impose on perception and analysis. Moral thinking often prevents accurate assessment of situations because it filters information through categories of good and evil rather than evaluating information based on its accuracy and relevance. The amoral person can assess people, situations, and opportunities more accurately because they're not imposing moral interpretations that may obscure important information. They can recognize others' actual motivations rather than projecting moral assumptions onto their behavior. They can identify real problems rather than focusing on issues that feel morally important but don't actually affect outcomes. This clarity enables more effective responses to challenges and more successful exploitation of opportunities because decisions are based on accurate information rather than moral interpretations of that information. Finally, the liberation from moral constraints enables what philosophers call authentic self-creation, the development of your genuine nature and capabilities without the limitations that moral frameworks impose on personal growth and self-expression. The moral person constantly evaluates their development against external standards of what they should become, rather than internal understanding of what they could become. They suppress aspects of their nature that moral frameworks disapprove of and emphasize aspects that moral systems reward, creating artificial personalities rather than authentic self-expression. The amoral person can develop their complete nature without moral limitations. They can embrace their competitive drives, their desire for recognition, their ambition for influence, their capacity for strategic thinking. They can become fully themselves rather than morally acceptable versions of themselves. This authentic development typically produces more powerful and ultimately more beneficial individuals because it develops genuine capabilities rather than performed virtues, real strengths rather than moral postures, authentic contributions rather than virtuous gestures. You have now seen beyond the veil of moral illusion into the reality that governs all effective action. There is no good or evil, only benefit and loss, only consequences that serve your authentic interests or consequences that work against them, only strategies that produce the outcomes you want, or strategies that prevent you from achieving your goals. Direct, unflinching eye contact with camera. The choice before you is final and irreversible. Once you understand that moral categories are human inventions rather than universal truths, you cannot return to the comfortable certainty that moral thinking provides. You must decide whether to continue operating from artificial moral constraints that limit your effectiveness or to embrace strategic thinking that maximizes your ability to create the outcomes you actually desire. If you choose to maintain moral thinking, understand what you are accepting. You are choosing to make decisions based on abstract principles rather than practical consequences. You are accepting limitations on your strategies that may prevent you from achieving your authentic goals. You are agreeing to feel guilty about natural human drives that could serve both your interests and others' welfare if developed and expressed strategically. You are committing to judge actions by their conformity to moral categories rather than their effectiveness in producing positive results. You are embracing a decision-making framework that has consistently produced inferior outcomes compared to strategic approaches while providing the psychological comfort of feeling virtuous about your limitations. But if you choose strategic freedom, if you decide to abandon moral categories and evaluate all actions based on benefit and loss, you are accepting something far more challenging and far more rewarding. You are choosing to take full responsibility for your outcomes without the comfort of external moral authorities to guide your decisions. You are embracing the necessity of developing your own judgment about what works and what doesn't, what serves your authentic interests and what undermines them, what creates genuine value and what merely creates the appearance of virtue. You are accepting that others may disapprove of your strategic choices because those choices violate moral frameworks that others use to guide their more limited lives. You are recognizing that strategic effectiveness often appears immoral to people who have not developed beyond moral thinking. But you are also accessing possibilities that moral people never experience. You are gaining the ability to pursue your authentic goals without internal resistance from artificial guilt and shame. You are developing the capacity to solve problems that moral approaches cannot address. You are creating opportunities for genuine contribution that emerge from strength rather than obligation. The universe operates according to principles of cause and effect, competition and cooperation, adaptation and selection. These principles are neither good nor evil. They are simply the forces that determine outcomes. Understanding and working with these principles produces better results than fighting against them in service of moral ideals that have no basis in reality. Your success, your happiness, your ability to contribute meaningfully to others' lives, all of these depend not on your moral purity, but on your strategic effectiveness. The person who abandons moral limitations and learns to think strategically serves not just their own interests, but typically serves others more effectively than the person who remains trapped in moral constraints. The world doesn't need more morally limited people who feel virtuous about their ineffectiveness. The world needs strategically intelligent people who can create genuine value, solve real problems, and contribute to human flourishing through their competence rather than their virtue. There is no good or evil, only benefit and loss, only consequences that serve your authentic development or consequences that prevent it, only strategies that work or strategies that fail. The choice is yours. The responsibility is yours. The consequences, beneficial or costly, will be yours. What will you choose?